They left me in that cold nursing home, telling me it was for my own good. But the fire that night didn't just threaten the building. It burned the lies my son and his wife told me. I still remember the acrid smell of smoke mixed with the sterile disinfectant, my heart pounding as I realized I was utterly alone. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Maria Elena Gutierrez, and at 73 years old, I thought I knew what love looked like. I thought family meant everything. I was wrong about so many things, but I was right about one. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find yourself again. Every morning in that place started the same way. The harsh fluorescent lights would flicker on at 5:30, casting shadows across the pale green walls that smelled of bleach and broken dreams. I'd wake to the sound of wheelchairs creaking down the hallway, nurses speaking in hushed tones, and the constant beeping of machines that seemed to count down the remaining days of forgotten lives. My window overlooked 10th Avenue in Manhattan, where I could see the building where I'd lived for 42 years. From the third floor of the Sunset Manor nursing home, I could watch people rushing to work, carrying their coffee cups and their purposes, while I sat in a plastic chair wearing a hospital gown that never quite closed in the back. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was looking at my old neighborhood from a cage, watching life go on without me, while the people who put me there went on living in the home I'd built with my own hands and my husband's sweat. That Tuesday afternoon in October, everything changed. I remember because it was the day my son Ricardo was supposed to visit. I'd been sitting by the window since lunch, watching the autumn leaves dance on the sidewalk, waiting for his familiar figure to appear around the corner from the subway station. 3 o'clock came and went, then 4. By 5, the dinner trays were being wheeled down the hallway, and I knew he wasn't coming. Again, Mrs. Patterson, my roommate, was having one of her bad days. She'd been calling for her daughter since morning, the same daughter who hadn't visited in 3 months. The nurse, a tired woman named Joyce who always smelled like cigarettes and desperation, came in to check on us. "Any word from your son today, Maria?" she asked, adjusting Mrs. Patterson's blanket with mechanical efficiency. I shook my head, trying to swallow the lump in my throat. "He's probably busy with work." Joyce gave me that look. You know the one. The same look I'd been getting from everyone for 6 months. Pity mixed with something else. Something that said, "Your family doesn't care about you, and we all know it." But then I found it. Tucked inside the pocket of my cardigan, the one I'd been wearing the day they brought me here, was a crumpled piece of paper. My hands shook as I unfolded it. It was a note, written in Ricardo's handwriting, dated 3 weeks ago. "Can't make it today. Work emergency. Will call." He'd never called. I stared at that note until the words blurred together, remembering the weight of it in my pocket all this time. How many visits had he canceled? How many promises had he broken? How many times had I made excuses for him while sitting in this plastic chair, watching life happen without me? The smell of institutional food drifted from the cafeteria, mixing with the antiseptic that seemed to coat everything in this place. But underneath it all, I caught a whiff of something else, something that reminded me of home. The faint scent of the wooden floorboards in my apartment, the ones Ricardo's father had installed with his own hands in 1982. That apartment, my apartment, the one I'd been paying rent on for 4 decades, the one where I'd raised Ricardo, the one where I'd nursed his father through cancer, the one where I'd planned to die with dignity surrounded by my memories and my books and my plants that knew my voice. Instead, I was here, watching my life through a window, while they lived their lives in my space, with my furniture, probably sleeping in my bed. Do you know what it feels like to be erased while you're still breathing? To watch your life continue without you? Like you were never really there at all? I folded the note carefully and put it back in my pocket. This time, I wouldn't make excuses. This time, I would remember. Let me tell you how I got here, because the path to betrayal is always paved with love and good intentions. At least, that's what they tell you. 43 years ago, I married Roberto Gutierrez in a small ceremony at St. Anthony's Church on Sullivan Street. I was 29, he was 31, and we were so poor that my wedding dress was borrowed from my sister Carmen, and his suit came from Goodwill. But we were rich in dreams, rich in hope, rich in the kind of love that makes you believe you can build something beautiful together. We moved into a 1-bedroom apartment on West 23rd Street, 3rd floor walk-up, with a view of the fire escape and the sound of the city singing us to sleep every night. Roberto worked construction, leaving at dawn with his lunch pail and his thermos of coffee, coming home at sunset with plaster dust in his hair and stories about the buildings he was helping create. I worked at the garment factory on 14th Street, sewing hems and buttons for dresses that rich women would wear to parties I'd never be invited to. But I was proud of my work, proud of the steady rhythm of my sewing machine, proud of the paycheck that helped us save for something better. When Ricardo came along 2 years later, everything changed. Not in the way people warned me it would, with sleepless nights and endless worry, but in a way that made the world brighter, more full of purpose. This tiny person with his father's dark eyes and my stubborn chin became the center of everything we did. Roberto would come home from work and scoop Ricardo up, spinning him around the tiny living room while I cooked dinner on our 2-burner stove. We'd eat together at the small table by the window, planning Ricardo's future like architects designing a cathedral. "He's going to college," Roberto would say, bouncing Ricardo on his knee. "He's going to have opportunities we never had." And I believed him. We both did. When Ricardo was 5, Roberto's back gave out. Years of lifting concrete blocks and steel beams had compressed his spine until standing upright became an act of will rather than instinct. The construction company had no use for a man who couldn't lift, couldn't bend, couldn't do the work that had been slowly killing him for 15 years. We burned through our savings in 3 months. The disability payments barely covered rent, and the jobs I could get didn't pay enough to keep us afloat. That's when we made the first of many sacrifices that would define our lives. I started cleaning office buildings at night. After spending 10 hours sewing at the factory, I'd pick up Ricardo from school, help him with homework, cook dinner, and then take him to my sister's house so I could scrub toilets and empty trash cans until dawn. Roberto stayed home with his pain medication and his guilt, watching game shows and soap operas while his world got smaller and smaller. The man who'd once built skyscrapers was defeated by his own body, and I watched him fade a little more each day. But Ricardo was our light, our purpose, our reason to keep fighting. I saved every extra penny for his future. While other kids got new sneakers and video games, Ricardo got my promises that someday, if he worked hard enough, if he was smart enough, if he was good enough, he would have everything we couldn't give him. He was good enough, honor roll every semester, student council, baseball team, the kind of kid teachers remembered years later, the kind of son who made other parents wish their children were more like him. When he graduated high school, we had enough saved for 2 years of community college. It wasn't Columbia or NYU, but it was education, it was hope. It was the first rung on a ladder that would take him away from the world that had broken his father's back and worn away my youth one night shift at a time. He studied business, said he wanted to understand money, wanted to know how to make it work for him instead of the other way around. I was so proud of him, my son who could talk about investments and profit margins like they were old friends. After community college, he got a job at a small financial firm in Midtown, entry-level, barely above minimum wage, but he wore a tie to work and carried a briefcase like a man who belonged in that world of glass towers and important meetings. That's where he met Sophia. Sophia Brennan, with her perfectly straightened blonde hair and her MBA from some expensive school upstate. She was everything I wasn't. Educated, sophisticated, born into the kind of family that took weekend trips to the Hamptons and knew which fork to use for salad. Ricardo was smitten from the first day she smiled at him across the copy machine. He'd come home talking about her laugh, her intelligence, her ambition. He'd never talked about a girl that way before, and I was happy for him. I wanted him to find love, wanted him to have the kind of partnership Roberto and I had built together. But something changed when Sophia entered our lives. Gradually, so slowly I didn't notice at first, Ricardo started pulling away. Family dinners became less frequent, holiday visits got shorter, phone calls turned into text messages, and text messages turned into silence punctuated by brief updates about his life that felt more like reports than conversations. "He's just busy," Roberto would say when I worried out loud. "He's building his career, making something of himself. Isn't that what we wanted?" And it was. It was exactly what we'd wanted. So why did it feel like we were losing him? When Roberto got sick again, this time with the cancer that would take him piece by piece over 18 months, Ricardo was sympathetic but distant. He'd visit on Sundays, usually with Sophia, bringing flowers and small talk that never quite touched the raw edges of what we were going through. I watched my husband disappear into himself as the disease ate away at his body, and I watched my son disappear into a life that had no room for the messy reality of aging parents and medical bills, and the smell of death hanging in the air like smoke. The night Roberto died, Ricardo held my hand at the hospital and cried with me. For a moment, it felt like we were connected again, like grief had stripped away all the distance that had grown between us. "I'm here, Mama," he whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." He lied. Or maybe he meant it in that moment and changed his mind later. Either way, the man I buried wasn't just Roberto. I buried the last piece of my son that belonged to me. The funeral was small. Roberto's construction buddies, now old men with bent backs and calloused hands, came to pay their respects. My sister Carmen flew in from Phoenix, where she'd moved after her husband retired. A few neighbors from the building, people who'd known Roberto for decades, brought casseroles and awkward condolences. Sophia stood beside Ricardo in a black dress that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 3 months, checking her phone while the priest talked about eternal rest and blessed memories. After the burial, people came back to the apartment for coffee and sandwiches. I remember standing in my kitchen, the same kitchen where Roberto and I had planned our dreams, listening to conversations that floated around me like smoke. Such a tragedy. So young. Maria's been so strong through all of this. At least Ricardo's doing well for himself. That last comment came from Mrs. Rossi, who lived across the hall and had watched Ricardo grow up. She meant it as a comfort, but it felt like a knife between my ribs. Yes, Ricardo was doing well. His business was growing, he'd been promoted twice. He and Sophia had moved to a nice apartment in Brooklyn Heights with a view of the Manhattan Bridge. He was doing so well that paying for his father's funeral had required him to restructure some investments, as he put it. He was doing so well that the medical bills from Roberto's final months had to be paid out of my tiny savings account, the one I'd been adding to dollar by dollar for 40 years. But he was doing well, and that's what mattered. That's what I told myself as I signed over the last of my financial security to keep us from going bankrupt while buying our family peace. 3 months after Roberto's funeral, Ricardo and Sophia got married in a ceremony in the Hamptons at her family's country club. I wore the same black dress I'd worn to the funeral because it was the only formal outfit I owned. I sat at a table with Sophia's relatives, people I'd never met who spoke to me with the kind of careful politeness you use with the help. The wedding cost more than Roberto and I had made in 10 years combined. Sophia's parents paid for most of it, but Ricardo contributed what he could, including a loan against his growing investment portfolio that had apparently made him quite comfortable. I was proud of him. Even as I sat there feeling out of place and forgotten, I was proud that my son had climbed so far above where he'd started. This was what Roberto and I had sacrificed for, what we'd dreamed of during all those years of working 2 jobs and saving pennies. So why did watching him dance with his beautiful wife feel like watching a stranger? After the wedding, my visits to their new apartment became increasingly rare. Sophia would smile when I came over, but it was the kind of smile that never reached her eyes, the kind that made it clear I was being tolerated rather than welcomed. "Mom, you don't have to visit so often," Ricardo said one Sunday as I was getting ready to leave. "We're both so busy with work, and I know the subway ride from Manhattan is getting harder for you." He was right about the subway ride. At 68, navigating the steps and the crowds was becoming more challenging, but it was the only way I had to stay connected to the life he was building without me. "Maybe we could have lunch once a month instead," Sophia suggested, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. "Somewhere in the city, more convenient for you. Once a month." After raising this man from birth, after sacrificing everything for his future, I was being scheduled into his life like a dentist appointment, but I agreed. What choice did I have? The alternative was losing him completely, and I wasn't ready for that kind of grief again so soon after losing Roberto. Those monthly lunches became the highlight of my existence and the source of my deepest pain. Ricardo would tell me about his work, about the stocks that were performing well, about the investment strategies that were building his wealth. He'd ask polite questions about my health, my neighbors, whether I needed anything. But he never asked how I was really doing. Never asked about the nights I lay awake missing Roberto's breathing beside me. Never asked about the mornings I woke up and forgot for just a moment that he was gone, reaching across the bed to touch empty air. Never asked about the bills that were becoming harder to manage on Social Security and the small pension from the garment factory. Never asked about the way the apartment felt too big and too small at the same time, full of memories but empty of life. I didn't tell him about these things either. How could I burden him with my loneliness when he was building such a successful life? How could I ask for help when I'd raised him to be independent and strong? 2 years passed like this. Monthly lunches punctuated by birthday cards and Christmas visits that felt more like duty calls than genuine affection. I told myself this was normal, that adult children were supposed to build their own lives, that I should be grateful for whatever connection we still had. Then Sophia got pregnant. The day Ricardo called to tell me I was going to be a grandmother, I cried with joy for the first time since Roberto's death. A grandchild meant family again. It meant purpose. Someone new to love and to be loved by in return. I started knitting immediately. Tiny blankets and booties in soft yellow since they didn't know the baby's gender yet. I bought books about being a grandmother, about the special bond between grandparents and grandchildren. I imagined Sunday dinners and bedtime stories and all the ways I would be part of this new life. Isabella Rose was born on a snowy February morning, 8 pounds and 2 ounces of perfect possibility. When Ricardo placed her in my arms for the first time, I felt something wake up inside me that had been sleeping since Roberto's death. She had his dark eyes and tiny fingers that gripped my thumb with surprising strength. She was family in the truest sense, a continuation of everything Roberto and I had built together. "She's going to be so lucky to have you as her grandmother," Ricardo said. And for a moment, everything felt right again. For the first year of Isabella's life, I was essential. Sophia went back to work after maternity leave, and they needed someone reliable to babysit. Someone who wouldn't charge them the astronomical rates that professional nannies demanded. Someone who would love Isabella as much as they did. I moved my life around Isabella's schedule. Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, plus occasional evenings when they had work events or date nights. I'd take the subway to Brooklyn Heights, climb 3 flights of stairs to their beautiful apartment, and spend precious hours holding my granddaughter, feeding her, singing her the same lullabies I'd sung to Ricardo 40 years ago. Those were the happiest months I'd had since Roberto died. Isabella knew my voice, knew my smell, would stop crying when I picked her up. I was needed again, useful again, loved in the uncomplicated way that only babies can love. But as Isabella grew older, my usefulness began to diminish. "Mom, we're thinking about putting Isabella in daycare," Sophia announced one Tuesday when I arrived for my usual babysitting session. "She needs more socialization with other children, more structured activities." Translation: "We don't need you anymore." "But she's so young," I protested. "She's barely 18 months old. Isn't it better for her to be with family?" Sophia's smile was patronizing. "The daycare center near our office has an excellent program, very educational, and it would give you more free time to focus on yourself, focus on myself. Like I was some old woman with hobbies and interests beyond loving my family. Like I had a life worth living that didn't revolve around being needed by the people I'd given everything to create. They didn't fire me outright. I was still allowed to babysit occasionally, when their regular arrangements fell through, when the daycare was closed for holidays, when they needed someone in an emergency. I went from being essential to being backup help. Around this time, Ricardo's investment portfolio was doing exceptionally well. He'd gotten involved in some tech stocks early, had put money into cryptocurrency when Bitcoin was still relatively cheap, had diversified into real estate investment trusts that were paying handsome dividends. "I might be able to retire early if this keeps up," he told me over lunch one day, showing me numbers on his phone that meant nothing to me, but apparently meant financial freedom to him. He was making more money in a year than Roberto and I had made in a decade. His wealth was growing faster than he could spend it, compounding and multiplying through investment strategies I couldn't understand. And I was eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner because the cost of groceries had gone up again, and my Social Security check hadn't. I didn't tell him about the peanut butter sandwiches. I didn't tell him about the nights I turned the heat down to 60 degrees to save money on the electric bill. I didn't tell him about the prescription medications I was skipping because I couldn't afford them all. He was building his fortune, his future, his American dream. How could I burden him with my struggles when he was achieving everything Roberto and I had wanted for him? But sometimes I wondered if he remembered where that success had come from. If he thought about the years Roberto and I had worked extra shifts to pay for his school clothes, his baseball equipment, his college application fees. If he understood that every dollar in his investment portfolio had roots in our sacrifice. During one of our increasingly infrequent phone calls, Ricardo mentioned that he and Sophia were looking at houses in Westchester County. "The schools are better there," he explained, "and we'd have more space, maybe room for another baby eventually. Another baby. Another grandchild I'd see a few times a year if I was lucky." "That's wonderful," I said, meaning it despite the ache in my chest. "I'm so proud of how well you're doing." "Thanks, Mom. You and Dad really set me up for success. All those sacrifices you made, they really paid off." For a moment, hearing him acknowledge what Roberto and I had given him, I felt vindicated. He did remember. He did understand. But then he continued, "I just hope I can give Isabella and any future kids the same advantages, you know. Set them up so they never have to worry about money the way you and Dad did. The way you and Dad did. Like our financial struggles had been a choice rather than a circumstance. Like we could have simply decided to invest in Bitcoin and tech stocks, instead of working ourselves to exhaustion just to keep a roof over our heads." But I swallowed my hurt and said what he needed to hear. That's what every parent wants for their children. 6 months later, they bought the house in Scarsdale. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a 2-car garage, and a backyard big enough for Isabella to run around in. The mortgage payment was probably more than I'd ever made in a year, but Ricardo's investments were performing so well that money wasn't a concern. My concerns were different. How would I visit my granddaughter when she lived an hour away by train? How would I maintain any connection to their lives when I was already being phased out of their daily routine? The answer became clear pretty quickly. I wouldn't. My visits to see Isabella became special occasions rather than regular occurrences. Birthday parties where I sat in the corner, while Sophia's relatives dominated the conversation. Holiday dinners where I felt like a guest rather than family. Isabella barely knew me anymore. When I'd try to hug her, she'd squirm away and run to her other grandmother, Sophia's mother Margaret, who lived 20 minutes away and saw her twice a week. Margaret was everything I wasn't. Wealthy, educated, socially connected. She could afford to take Isabella to Broadway shows and fancy restaurants, could buy her expensive toys and clothes without thinking about the cost. She lived in the same world as Ricardo and Sophia, spoke their language of private schools and country clubs and investment strategies. I was the poor grandmother, the one from the old neighborhood, the reminder of where the family had come from, rather than a participant in where they were going. Isabella just connects more easily with people she sees regularly, Sophia explained when I mentioned feeling left out. Children need consistency. Consistency. Like I was some disruptive influence in my granddaughter's life, rather than the woman who'd held her as a newborn, who'd changed her diapers and sang her to sleep and loved her before she was even born. But I nodded and smiled and pretended to understand. Because what was the alternative? Fighting for a role in their lives that they clearly didn't want me to have? By Isabella's third birthday, my transformation from essential family member to occasional visitor was complete. I sent presents through the mail rather than delivering them in person. I got updates about her milestones through text messages rather than witnessing them myself. Ricardo called every few weeks, brief conversations that felt more like check-ins than genuine connection. How's your health, Mom? Fine, Ricardo. How's Isabella? Growing like a weed. Sophia's pregnant again, did I tell you? Another grandchild I'd never really know. Another generation growing up without understanding where they came from or who had sacrificed for their privileged lives. The second baby was a boy they named Robert, after his grandfather. I cried when Ricardo told me the name, touched that they'd chosen to honor Roberto's memory. Maybe this was their way of acknowledging the foundation he'd built for their success. But when I finally met little Robert at his christening, I realized the name was just a gesture, a nod to the past that didn't translate into present-day inclusion. He was a beautiful baby, but he was a stranger to me, and I was a stranger to him. That's when the conversations about my future began. It started subtly. Casual comments dropped into our phone calls like seeds of concern. Mom, are you sure you're okay living alone in that apartment? Have you thought about what you'll do if you get sick and need help? Sophia's been reading about these wonderful senior communities, much safer than living alone. At first, I dismissed their concerns as overthinking. I was 70, not 90. I could still take care of myself, still manage my own life. The apartment might be old and the neighborhood a little rougher than it used to be, but it was my home. It held every memory of the life Roberto and I had built together. But they kept pushing, gently but persistently, like water wearing away stone. We just worry about you, Mom. What if you fell and no one found you for days? The crime rate in your neighborhood has really gone up lately. Think about Isabella and Robert. Don't you want them to have time to really get to know their grandmother? That last argument was the one that got to me. The promise that moving closer to them would mean more involvement in my grandchildren's lives, more family dinners and bedtime stories, and all the connection I'd been missing. They had a solution. Sunset Manor, a luxury senior living community in Westchester, only 15 minutes from their house. They showed me the brochure during one of my rare visits. Glossy photos of smiling elderly people playing cards and tending gardens and looking fulfilled in ways I hadn't felt in years. It's not a nursing home, Sophia assured me. It's independent living for active seniors. You'd have your own apartment, but with the security of knowing help is available if you need it. The apartments were nice, I had to admit. 1 bedroom, kitchenette, private bathroom, clean and safe and utterly soulless. Nothing like the home Roberto and I had made together, but comfortable enough for an old woman with nowhere else to go. What about my apartment? I asked. Well, you've been paying rent on that place for over 40 years, Ricardo said. Your name is still on the lease, so you could probably get something for it if you wanted to sell your interest. Sell my interest. In the home where I'd raised him, where I'd cared for his dying father, where every corner held memories they couldn't price or package or relocate to Westchester County. But I was tired. Tired of being alone, tired of worrying about money, tired of feeling disconnected from the only family I had left. The promise of being closer to Isabella and Robert, of being included again, was too tempting to resist. Let me think about it, I said. That night, I walked through my apartment touching everything Roberto and I had chosen together. The kitchen table where we'd eaten thousands of meals. The couch where we'd watched the news and held hands during scary movies. The bedroom where we'd made love and made plans and made our son. Could I really leave all of this behind? Could I trust that Ricardo and Sophia's promises about family involvement were genuine this time? In the morning, I called Ricardo and told him I'd move to Sunset Manor. The decision once made moved forward with surprising speed. Ricardo and Sophia handled all the arrangements, touring the facility, filling out applications, setting up the financing. Because of course there was financing involved. Sunset Manor wasn't cheap. The monthly fees were more than my Social Security and pension combined. The difference would need to come from somewhere else. Don't worry about the money, Mom, Ricardo said when I expressed concern. I can cover the shortfall until we figure out something more permanent. Something more permanent? I should have asked what that meant. Should have insisted on understanding the financial arrangement completely. But I was so grateful for his willingness to help, so touched that he was finally taking care of me the way I'd taken care of him, that I didn't push for details. The move itself was traumatic. 43 years of life condensed into a few boxes of photographs and personal items. Everything else, the furniture Roberto had built, the dishes we'd eaten from for decades, the books I'd collected over a lifetime, stayed behind. Storage is limited in the new place, Sophia explained. And you'll want to start fresh anyway. Start fresh. At 70 years old, after a lifetime of accumulating memories and possessions that told the story of who I was and where I came from. The apartment at Sunset Manor was exactly as advertised. Clean, safe, and utterly devoid of personality. The walls were beige, the carpet was beige, the furniture was the kind of generic stuff you'd find in any hotel room. It smelled like cleaning supplies and new paint, nothing like the lived-in warmth of home. But Ricardo and Sophia were enthusiastic about my new living situation. Isn't this great, Mom? No more worrying about maintenance or security. Everything's taken care of. And you're so much closer to us now. The kids can visit all the time. The kids. Isabella was 4 now, old enough to understand that Grandma had moved to a new place. But when they brought her to see my apartment for the first time, she seemed confused, and maybe a little scared. "Where are all your pictures, Abuela?" she asked, looking around at the bare walls. They're packed away for now, sweetheart. Maybe we can put some up later." But I never did put them up. Somehow, hanging my old family photos on those generic walls felt like admitting this was home now, and I wasn't ready for that acknowledgement. For the first few months, Ricardo and Sophia visited regularly, just as they'd promised. Sunday dinners in the communal dining room, walks around the grounds, playing with Isabella and Robert in the courtyard. It felt like family again, like I'd made the right decision. But gradually, the visits became less frequent. "We're so busy with work right now, Mom. This big project is requiring a lot of overtime. Isabella has soccer practice on Sundays now. You understand how important it is for kids to stay active. Robert's been sick, and we don't want to bring germs to the facility." Each excuse was reasonable on its own, but together they formed a pattern I recognized from years before. The slow withdrawal, the gradual decrease in contact, the transformation from family member to obligation. By my second year at Sunset Manor, their visits had dwindled to major holidays and my birthday. Phone calls became text messages. Text messages became silence, punctuated by occasional updates about the children's activities. I tried to build a life within the walls of the facility, joined the book club, attended movie nights, played bingo with the other residents. But it felt like playing house, going through the motions of living without actually feeling alive. The other residents were nice enough, but most of them were dealing with their own family disappointments, their own stories of children who'd grown too busy or too distant to maintain meaningful relationships. We were like a support group for abandoned parents, bonding over our shared experience of loving people who no longer had room for us in their lives. Meanwhile, I noticed things. Small things at first, then bigger ones. Like the fact that Ricardo never asked about money anymore. The monthly fees for Sunset Manor were being paid, but I had no idea from where. He'd said he would cover the shortfall temporarily, but we'd never discussed what the permanent solution would be. When I asked about it during one of his increasingly rare phone calls, he was vague. "Don't worry about that now, Mom. It's all taken care of. But Ricardo, I need to understand what's happening with my finances. Am I using up my savings? Are you paying out of pocket? Is there some kind of payment plan? Mom, you don't need to stress about this stuff anymore. That's why you moved to Sunset Manor, remember? So you wouldn't have to worry about all these complicated financial issues." But they weren't complicated to me. They were my life, my security, my ability to maintain some independence even while living in a facility. I had a right to know where the money was coming from and how long it would last. I'd feel better if I understood the arrangement, I pressed. "Look, we'll sit down and go over everything next time I visit, okay? I don't have the paperwork with me right now." But the next visit never came, and the paperwork was never explained. Then there was the issue of my apartment. My old apartment, the one I'd lived in for over 4 decades. the one where my name was still on the lease. I'd assumed Ricardo would handle the process of ending my tenancy, returning my security deposit, maybe getting some kind of settlement for the improvements Roberto had made over the years. But when I asked about it, he seemed surprised. Oh, that. Yeah, we're still working on that. The landlord's being difficult about the lease transfer. Transfer? I thought we were ending my lease. Well, we might need to keep it for a while longer. You know, in case you want to have somewhere to go back to. Go back to? I'd given up that apartment to move here. Why would I need to go back? Something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. The conversations were too vague, the answers too evasive, the promises too nonspecific. And then there was the fire. It happened on a Tuesday night in March, my third year at Sunset Manor. I was lying in bed, reading a mystery novel and trying to convince myself that the institutional smell of the place was becoming familiar, rather than unbearable, when the fire alarm started screaming. At first, I thought it was another drill. The facility was meticulous about safety procedures, testing alarms and evacuation plans regularly. But this sound was different, more urgent, more panicked. Then I smelled the smoke. Not the controlled, predictable smoke of someone's cigarette or the cafeteria's overused oven, but the acrid chemical smell of something seriously wrong, something dangerous. I got out of bed and opened my door to find the hallway filled with smoke and chaos. Residents were stumbling out of their rooms in bathrobes and slippers, some using walkers, others in wheelchairs, all of us moving as quickly as we could toward the emergency exits. The staff was trying to maintain order, but you could see the fear in their eyes, too. This wasn't a drill. This was the real thing, the nightmare scenario that everyone in a senior facility thinks about but hopes never to experience. I grabbed my purse and the small box of photographs I kept by my bed, the only truly irreplaceable things in that generic apartment, and joined the stream of people heading for the stairs. 3 flights down, my arthritic knees screaming with each step, my lungs burning from the smoke that was getting thicker despite the ventilation system's efforts to clear it. By the time we reached the ground floor, several residents had collapsed and were being carried by staff members and paramedics who'd arrived ahead of the fire trucks. Outside, we huddled in the parking lot while the firefighters worked to contain the blaze. It had started in the kitchen, someone said. An electrical fire that spread through the ventilation system faster than anyone had anticipated. I stood there in my nightgown and slippers, clutching my box of photos, watching smoke pour out of the windows of the place I'd been trying to convince myself was home. Around me, other residents were crying, holding on to each other, calling family members on cell phones. I reached for my phone to call Ricardo, to let him know I was safe, but that this place he'd chosen for me was burning down around us. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial his number. It went straight to voicemail. I tried again. Voicemail again. I tried Sophia's number. Voicemail. For 2 hours, I stood in that parking lot watching the fire department work, waiting for my son to call me back. Watching other residents embrace family members who'd rushed over as soon as they heard the news, watching people who were loved and worried about and valued enough for their children to drop everything and come running. At midnight, my phone finally rang. Mom, I just saw your missed calls. Is everything okay? Ricardo, there was a fire at Sunset Manor. I'm okay, but the building is damaged and they're evacuating everyone and I don't know where I'm supposed to go. Silence on the other end. Ricardo, did you hear me? Yeah, I heard you. Jesus, are you hurt? No, I'm not hurt, but I can't go back to my apartment tonight. Maybe not for weeks while they repair the damage. I need somewhere to stay. Another pause. In the background, I could hear the television, the sound of normal life continuing while mine was literally going up in smoke. Okay, let me talk to Sophia and figure out what we can do. Can they put you up in a hotel for tonight? The facility is arranging temporary housing, but Ricardo, this is serious. What if the building can't be repaired? What if I need to find somewhere else to live? Let's not panic, Mom. It's probably not as bad as it looks. These old buildings can take a lot of damage and still be salvageable. Old buildings. Sunset Manor was less than 10 years old, modern construction with state-of-the-art safety systems. But it was burning, and I was homeless, and my son was more concerned about not panicking than about his mother's immediate safety and shelter. I'll call you tomorrow, he said, once we know more about the situation, and he hung up. I spent that night in a Red Cross shelter set up at a nearby church, sleeping on a cot next to Mrs. Henderson from down the hall, who snored and muttered in her sleep about her son in California who hadn't visited in 3 years. The next morning, Ricardo called back. Good news, Mom. I talked to the Sunset Manor people and they think they can have your section of the building habitable again within a month. 6 weeks at the outside. What am I supposed to do for 6 weeks, Ricardo? Well, they're arranging temporary housing for all the displaced residents. Some kind of hotel arrangement, I think. You'll be fine. Fine. I'd be fine living in a hotel room for 6 weeks, eating takeout food, with no access to my belongings and no idea what was happening to my life. Ricardo, couldn't I stay with you and Sophia during the repairs? It's only temporary, and I could help with the children. The silence that followed that question told me everything I needed to know. Mom, that's not really practical right now. We don't have a guest room, and the kids have their routines, and Sophia's really stressed with work right now. They lived in a 4-bedroom house in Scarsdale. They had a guest room. I'd seen it during my handful of visits over the years. But I wasn't welcome there. My own son, my own grandchildren, and I wasn't welcome in their home during a crisis that had left me with nowhere to go. I understand, I said, even though I didn't understand at all. The hotel was a budget place near the highway, the kind of anonymous space where traveling salesmen stayed and families stopped during long car trips. My room had 2 double beds, a small table, and a view of the parking lot. The carpet was brown and stained. The walls were thin enough that I could hear every conversation and television program in the adjacent rooms, and the whole place smelled like disinfectant and despair. I spent 6 weeks there, eating microwaved dinners and watching daytime television, waiting for updates about when I could return to Sunset Manor. Ricardo called every few days to check on me, brief conversations that felt more like duty than genuine concern. Any word on when you can move back? How's the hotel? Do you need anything? What I needed was family. What I needed was to feel like I mattered to someone. Like my displacement from the only home I'd known for 3 years was more than just a minor inconvenience in their busy lives. But I didn't say that. I said I was fine, that the hotel was adequate, that I appreciated his concern. When Sunset Manor finally reopened, I was one of the first residents to move back in. My apartment had been cleaned and repainted, all traces of smoke damage erased. It looked exactly like it had before the fire. Beige walls, generic furniture, the smell of industrial cleaning products. But something had changed during those 6 weeks in the hotel. Or maybe something had been revealed that I'd been trying not to see. I wasn't just isolated anymore. I was disposable. The realization hit me fully a few weeks after returning to Sunset Manor, when I was going through my mail and found something that made my blood turn to ice. A bank statement for an account I didn't remember opening, showing regular withdrawals that coincided perfectly with the monthly fees for my residence at the facility. The account was in my name, but the address was Ricardo's house in Scarsdale. I stared at that statement for an hour, trying to understand what I was seeing. Then I called the bank. Yes, Mrs. Gutierrez. The customer service representative confirmed after I'd provided all my identification information. This account was opened 3 years ago with a significant initial deposit. The monthly automatic withdrawals you're seeing are for, let me check, Sunset Manor Senior Living. Who opened this account? I asked, though I already knew the answer. It shows here that your son Ricardo Gutierrez opened it on your behalf, using power of attorney documentation. Power of attorney. I'd never signed power of attorney papers. I'd never given anyone permission to access my finances or make banking decisions for me. Can you tell me where the initial deposit came from? More clicking of computer keys. It appears to have been a transfer from a real estate transaction. The memo line says apartment lease transfer. Apartment lease transfer. My old apartment. The one where I'd lived for over 40 years. The one where my name was still on the lease. The one Ricardo said they were still working on with the difficult landlord. He'd sold it. Sold the lease, pocketed the money, and used it to pay for my stay at Sunset Manor. Without telling me, without asking my permission, without even acknowledging that the home I'd shared with Roberto had monetary value that belonged to me. I hung up the phone and sat in the silence of my beige apartment, trying to process what I'd discovered. My son had essentially stolen my home and used the proceeds to imprison me in this place, all while making me feel grateful for his financial support. The apartment I'd assumed I could return to if things didn't work out at Sunset Manor no longer existed as far as I was concerned. Someone else was living there now. Someone who'd paid Ricardo for the right to occupy the space where I'd raised him, where I'd loved his father, where I'd planned to die with dignity. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that he'd done it all while maintaining the fiction that he was taking care of me, that the monthly payments for Sunset Manor were coming out of his own pocket as an act of filial devotion. I wasn't just isolated and disposable. I was being actively deceived and financially exploited by the person I'd loved most in the world. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the institutional bed in the institutional room, staring at the ceiling and remembering every sacrifice Roberto and I had made for Ricardo's future. Every extra shift I'd worked, every bill we'd delayed paying, every small luxury we'd denied ourselves so our son could have opportunities we'd never dreamed of. He'd taken those opportunities and built wealth beyond our wildest imagination, and then he'd used that wealth to buy himself the convenience of having his aging mother safely tucked away where she couldn't interfere with his comfortable life. The money from my apartment had paid for about 2 years of care at Sunset Manor. What would happen when it ran out? Would he find another asset of mine to liquidate? Would he finally acknowledge that he was supporting me financially, use it as leverage to make me grateful and compliant? Or would I simply be moved to a cheaper facility? Maybe one that was truly a nursing home, rather than the luxury senior living community he'd used to seduce me into giving up my independence? I thought about calling him, confronting him with what I'd discovered. But I knew that conversation would go. He'd have reasonable-sounding explanations for everything. He'd make it sound like he'd been protecting me from complicated financial decisions, like he'd been acting in my best interest all along. He'd make me feel like I was being paranoid and ungrateful, questioning the motives of a son who'd gone to such trouble to ensure my comfort and security. But I wasn't paranoid. I was finally seeing clearly. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done since moving to Sunset Manor. I took the train back to Manhattan. The old neighborhood looked smaller than I remembered, grittier, more crowded, but it was still alive in a way that Westchester would never be for me. People hurried along the sidewalks with purpose. Street vendors sold food that smelled like home. Children played in the small park where I'd taken Ricardo when he was little. I walked to my old building, the one where I'd lived for over 40 years, and stood across the street looking up at the third-floor windows. There were different curtains hanging there now, different plants on the fire escape. Someone else's life was happening in the space where Roberto and I had built our dreams. Mrs. Rossi was sitting on the front steps, catching some afternoon sun like she'd been doing for as long as I could remember. She looked up as I approached, her face brightening with recognition and surprise. "Maria, what are you doing here? I thought you moved to some fancy place upstate." "I did. I'm just visiting the old neighborhood." She patted the step beside her, inviting me to sit. For a few minutes, we watched the familiar rhythm of the street, both of us lost in memories. "You know," Mrs. Rossi said eventually, "I was sorry to see you go. You were one of the good ones, always looked out for your neighbors." "I miss it here," I admitted. "I miss feeling useful." She nodded knowingly. "My daughter keeps telling me I should move to one of those places too. Says it's safer, more convenient. But this is home, you know? These are my people. My people." When was the last time I'd felt like I belonged to a community of people who knew my history, who valued my presence, who treated me like a full human being, rather than a problem to be solved? "Mrs. Rossi, do you remember when Ricardo sold my lease? Did you meet the new tenants?" He looked confused. "Sold your lease? Honey, nobody sold anything. Your son's been paying the rent every month, just like always. As far as I know, that's still your apartment." The ground seemed to shift under me. "What do you mean he's been paying the rent?" "Well, maybe not him personally, but someone from his office calls the landlord every month to arrange payment. I figured you were planning to come back someday, maybe keeping the place as an option." I stared up at those third-floor windows with their unfamiliar curtains, trying to process what Mrs. Rossi was telling me. "Are you saying someone else is living in my apartment while Ricardo pays the rent?" "Oh no, dear. Nobody's living there. It's been empty since you left 3 years ago. I see people go in sometimes, maybe cleaning or checking on things. But nobody lives there. Empty. For 3 years, while I'd been warehoused in Sunset Manor, while I'd been told my old life was being wound down and settled, Ricardo had been maintaining my apartment as if I might return at any moment. But he'd also been preventing me from returning by lying about the lease situation, by telling me the landlord was being difficult, by making it sound like going back was impossible. And somehow, he'd managed to create phantom bank records showing a real estate transaction that had never happened, a lease transfer that was actually just ongoing rent payments. I didn't understand all the financial manipulations involved, but I understood the emotional manipulation perfectly. He wanted me to believe I had no choice but to stay at Sunset Manor, no option for independence, no life outside the institutional walls he'd chosen for me. "Mrs. Rossi, do you still have the landlord's phone number?" That evening, back in my beige prison, I made a phone call that changed everything. Mr. Kowalski had been the building's landlord for 15 years, ever since the previous owner died and left the property to his son. He remembered me well, remembered Roberto, remembered watching Ricardo grow up in 3B. "Mrs. Gutierrez, how are you enjoying your retirement? Your son tells me you're living in a beautiful place upstate now." "Mr. Kowalski, I need to ask you about my lease. Is my name still on it?" "Of course it is. Nothing's changed as far as the lease goes. Your son's been handling the rent payments, said you wanted to keep your options open in case you decided to move back. And the apartment is empty?" "Well, yes. Your son cleared out most of your belongings when you moved, but he asked me to keep the place available. Very considerate of him, making sure you had a safety net. A safety net I'd been told didn't exist. A home I'd been told was lost to me forever." "Mr. Kowalski, If I wanted to move back into my apartment, would that be possible? Of course. It's your apartment, Mrs. Gutierrez. Always has been. Though you might want to coordinate with your son about the rent situation since he's been handling all that. After I hung up, I sat in the silence of Sunset Manor trying to understand the scope of what had been done to me. Ricardo hadn't just moved me to an expensive senior facility and used my fictional real estate windfall to pay for it. He'd created an elaborate deception designed to make me believe I had no alternatives, no escape from the life he'd chosen for me. The bank account with the mysterious real estate deposit was probably funded by his own investment portfolio, maybe pulling from the stocks and cryptocurrency that had made him wealthy. He was paying for Sunset Manor out of his own pocket, but he'd constructed a fake paper trail to make me think the money came from selling my home. Why go to such elaborate lengths? Why not just tell me he was paying for my care as a gift, a way of giving back for all the sacrifices Roberto and I had made for him? Because gifts can be refused. Gifts create obligations and expectations of gratitude. Gifts acknowledge that the giver has power and the receiver is dependent. But if I thought I was paying my own way with money from my own real estate transaction, then I couldn't refuse the arrangement or demand changes. I could only be grateful that Ricardo was handling the complicated financial details on my behalf. It was a perfect trap, designed to keep me complacent and isolated while giving him complete control over my living situation and financial resources. Except now I knew the truth. And truth, even when it's ugly and painful, is still power. The next morning, without telling anyone at Sunset Manor where I was going, I took the train back to Manhattan and walked up 3 flights of stairs to apartment 3B. My key still worked. The apartment was exactly as Mrs. Rossi had described, empty but maintained. The walls had been repainted in the same color they'd always been. The hardwood floors Roberto had installed were still gleaming. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the spices I'd used for 40 years of cooking. But all the furniture was gone. All the photographs, all the books, all the small objects that had made this space a home rather than just an apartment. Everything that had told the story of Roberto's and my life together had been erased, leaving behind a clean, vacant shell. I walked through each room, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness, remembering where everything had been. The kitchen table by the window where we'd eaten breakfast every morning. The couch where we'd watched the news and held hands during movies. The bed where Roberto had died, holding my hand and telling me he loved me one last time. All of it gone, disposed of, or stored somewhere I'd never been told about. In the bedroom closet, I found a few boxes stacked in the corner. My hand shook as I opened the first one. Photographs, hundreds of them, documenting decades of life. Wedding pictures, baby pictures of Ricardo, holiday gatherings with extended family, vacation snapshots from the few trips Roberto and I had been able to afford. The second box contained documents, birth certificates, marriage license, Roberto's death certificate, medical records, insurance policies, all the paperwork that proved we'd existed, that our lives had mattered, that we'd been real people with real love and real loss. The third box was smaller, filled with jewelry and keepsakes. My wedding ring, which I'd stopped wearing after Roberto died because it made his absence too painful. His watch, the one he'd received after 20 years with the construction company. A locket my mother had given me on my 16th birthday, containing tiny photographs of my parents. Everything that mattered, everything that couldn't be replaced, had been preserved. But everything else, all the furniture and dishes and linens that had turned this apartment into a home, had been eliminated. Ricardo had saved the memories but erased the life. I spent the afternoon sitting on the floor of the empty living room, going through photographs and remembering what it felt like to be a person with a history, a context, a place in the world. The silence was different from the silence at Sunset Manor. This was the silence of a space waiting to be filled again, not the silence of a place where nothing would ever really happen. As the sun began to set, painting the familiar walls in shades of gold and amber, I made a decision. I was moving home. But first, I had a phone call to make. I bought a new cell phone on my way back to Sunset Manor that evening, one with a different number that Ricardo wouldn't recognize. The next morning, I used it to call several lawyers who advertised elder law and financial abuse services. The third lawyer I spoke to, Margaret Chen, listened carefully to my story and agreed to meet with me that afternoon. Mrs. Gutierrez, she said after I'd explained the situation with the fake bank account and the lies about my lease, what you're describing sounds like financial elder abuse. Even if your son was well-intentioned, he had no right to make these decisions without your informed consent. What can I do about it? First, we need to document everything. Get copies of all the bank records, the lease agreement, any power of attorney documents he may have forged or tricked you into signing. Second, we need to understand the full scope of his control over your finances. Are there other accounts or assets he's been managing without your knowledge? Other accounts. I hadn't thought about that. If Ricardo could create a phantom bank account for my Sunset Manor expenses, what else might he have been doing with my financial information? Third, Margaret continued, we need to establish your legal right to make your own decisions about where to live and how to spend your money. If you want to leave Sunset Manor and return to your apartment, no one can stop you. But if your son has been using financial manipulation to control your choices, we may need to take legal action to ensure he can't do it again. Legal action against my own son. 6 months ago, the thought would have been unthinkable. But 6 months ago, I hadn't understood the depth of his betrayal or the elaborate lies he'd constructed to maintain control over my life. What would that involve? Potentially, we could pursue charges for financial elder abuse, demand the return of any money he's taken without authorization, and seek a restraining order preventing him from making any financial decisions on your behalf. But Mrs. Gutierrez, I have to warn you, this kind of case often destroys family relationships permanently. Are you prepared for that possibility? Family relationships. What family relationships? I saw my son maybe 6 times a year for brief, superficial visits. I barely knew my grandchildren. I'd been systematically isolated from everyone I cared about and manipulated into believing it was for my own good. What was I really risking losing? The illusion of family connection while living in actual family abandonment? I want to explore my options, I told Margaret. Over the next 2 weeks, working with Margaret and a private investigator she recommended, I began to understand the full scope of Ricardo's financial manipulations. The phantom bank account was just the beginning. Using power of attorney documents I'd apparently signed during one of my early visits to Sunset Manor, documents I didn't remember signing but which bore what looked like my signature, Ricardo had been managing several aspects of my finances for 3 years. He'd consolidated my savings accounts, moved money between different institutions, and created a complex web of transactions that made it nearly impossible for me to understand where my money was or how it was being used. Most significantly, he'd been paying for Sunset Manor not with proceeds from selling my lease, as the bank records suggested, but with distributions from an investment account he'd created in my name. An account funded with money from my original savings, but managed entirely according to his investment strategy. Your son is actually quite good at financial planning, the investigator explained. The investments he made on your behalf have performed very well. Your account has more money in it now than when he started managing it 3 years ago. So he wasn't stealing from me? Not exactly. He was making money for you. But he was also lying to you about how your expenses were being paid, and he was making all these decisions without your knowledge or consent. Whether that constitutes theft depends on how you look at it. How I looked at it was simple. He'd taken away my right to make decisions about my own life, then constructed an elaborate fiction to keep me from understanding what he'd done. Even if he'd been financially successful on my behalf, even if his investment strategies had increased my net worth, he'd still robbed me of my autonomy and dignity. But there was one more discovery that changed everything. In addition to the investment account he'd created for my expenses, Ricardo had been using my financial information to enhance his own investment portfolio. Acting as my financial power of attorney, he'd taken out loans against my accounts to fund his cryptocurrency and stock market investments. Loans that were legally my responsibility, secured by my assets, but used entirely for his benefit. This, Margaret said, pointing to the loan documents, this is definitely theft. He's borrowed money in your name to fund his own investments, without your knowledge or consent. If those investments had gone bad, you would have been liable for the losses. But since they've been successful, he's been keeping the profits. The profits from investments made with loans secured by my money had funded Ricardo's move to Scarsdale, his children's private school tuition, probably the luxury car he drove, and the expensive vacations he took with Sophia. He'd been living off my financial foundation while simultaneously convincing me that I was entirely dependent on his generosity. Mrs. Gutierrez, Margaret said gently, you have enough evidence here for a significant financial elder abuse case. Your son has been systematically deceiving you and using your resources for his own benefit while keeping you isolated and dependent. The question is, what do you want to do about it? What did I want? I wanted my life back. I wanted to wake up in my own home, surrounded by my own things, making my own decisions about how to spend my days. I wanted to choose when to see my family and when to be alone, when to be social, and when to be solitary. I wanted to stop being managed and manipulated and lied to by people who claimed to love me, but treated me like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. I wanted justice, not revenge, but accountability. I wanted Ricardo to understand that what he'd done was wrong, that his elaborate deceptions had caused real harm, that loving someone doesn't give you the right to control their life. But most of all, I wanted the truth. No more lies about real estate transactions that never happened. No more phantom bank accounts and fictional financial arrangements. No more being treated like I was too senile or incompetent to understand my own life. I want to go home, I told Margaret, and I want my son to know that I know what he's done. The confrontation happened on a Sunday afternoon in October, almost exactly 1 year after I'd found that first crumpled note in my cardigan pocket. I arranged it carefully. Margaret helped me write a letter requesting a family meeting to discuss my living situation and financial arrangements. We sent it to both Ricardo and Sophia, asking them to come to Sunset Manor at 2 o'clock for what they would assume was a routine conversation about my care. But I had no intention of having the conversation at Sunset Manor. That morning, I took the train to Manhattan, unlocked my apartment door, and waited. At noon, I called Ricardo. "Hi, Mom. We got your letter about the meeting. Sophia and I will be there at 2. Actually, Ricardo, I need you to come to my apartment instead." Silence. "Your apartment?" "My apartment. 3B, same as always. I'm here now, and I need to talk to you and Sophia about some things I've discovered." "Mom, you can't just show up at the apartment without coordinating with me first. There are maintenance issues that need to be handled before you can be there safely." Maintenance issues. Even now, even when I was calling him from inside my own home, he was still trying to control the narrative. "The apartment is fine, Ricardo. I've been here for 3 hours and everything works perfectly. The question is, why have you been lying to me about the lease situation?" Another silence. Longer this time. "Mom, I think there's been some confusion. Let me come pick you up and take you back to Sunset Manor and we can sort this all out." "No, Ricardo, I'm not confused and I'm not leaving. If you want to talk, you come here. Both of you. 2 o'clock. I hung up before he could argue. At exactly 2 o'clock, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Then voices in the hallway. Ricardo and Sophia talking in low, urgent tones before knocking on my door. I opened it to find them both dressed as if they were going to a business meeting rather than visiting family. Ricardo looked nervous, uncomfortable. Sophia looked annoyed. "Maria," she said, stepping into the apartment without being invited, "what's all this about? We were expecting to meet you at Sunset Manor." "This is about truth," I said, closing the door behind them. "This is about honesty and respect, and the fact that I'm tired of being lied to." Ricardo was looking around the empty apartment with obvious discomfort. "Mom, you can't just decide to move back here without discussing it with us. Your health, your safety. We need to make sure you have proper support systems in place." "My health is fine, Ricardo. My safety is my own responsibility, not yours. And I don't need support systems. I need my family to stop lying to me." I gestured for them to sit on the floor since there was no furniture. They remained standing, both of them radiating tension and impatience. "I know about the bank account," I said. "The one you created with money from a real estate transaction that never happened." Ricardo's face flushed. "Mom, that's a complicated financial arrangement. I was trying to protect you from having to deal with all the paperwork, and I know about the investment account. The one you funded with my savings and used to pay for Sunset Manor while telling me you were covering the costs yourself." "Mom, I know about the loans, Ricardo. The ones you took out in my name to fund your own investments. The ones that made you wealthy while keeping me dependent." Sophia stepped forward, her voice sharp. "Maria, I don't know what you think you've discovered, but Ricardo has been nothing but generous with your care. The amount of money he's spent on your living situation, he's spent my money, Sophia. My money, managed without my consent, used for his benefit while he convinced me I was a burden on his finances." Ricardo finally found his voice. "It's not that simple, Mom. Yes, I used your accounts to make investments, but I made money for you. Your net worth is higher now than when you moved to Sunset Manor. That's not the point, and you know it." "Then what is the point?" Sophia demanded. "That you don't trust us? That you think we've been trying to hurt you somehow?" I looked at them both, these people who had systematically isolated me from my home, my community, my autonomy, while convincing themselves and me that they were acting in my best interest. "The point," I said slowly, "is that you never asked me what I wanted. You decided what was best for me, then you lied to me about the options, then you manipulated my finances to make me believe I had no choice." "We were protecting you," Ricardo said. "From what? From living in my own home? From making my own decisions? From having control over my own money? From making mistakes," Sophia said. "From being taken advantage of by people who don't care about you the way we do." The irony was breathtaking. She was literally describing what they had done to me while claiming to protect me from exactly that kind of exploitation. "I want you both to leave," I said. They stared at me in shock. "Mom, you can't be serious," Ricardo said. "You can't just throw away everything we've done for you because you're upset about some financial details you don't fully understand." "I understand perfectly. You took away my right to choose how to live my life. Then you constructed elaborate lies to keep me from realizing what you'd done. You isolated me from my home and my community while telling me it was for my own good. It was for your own good, Sophia insisted. Look at this place, Maria. It's empty, it's old, it's not safe for someone your age. It's my home. And whether it's safe or not is my decision to make. Ricardo tried a different approach, his voice softer, more manipulative. Mom, we're family. We love you. Everything we did was because we care about you and want what's best for you. If you loved me, you would have asked me what I wanted instead of deciding for me. We did ask you. We talked about Sunset Manor extensively before you moved there. After you'd already eliminated my other options by lying to me about my lease and my finances. He had no answer for that. Neither did Sophia. I want you to leave, I repeated, and I want you to transfer all my accounts back to my control. No more power of attorney, no more financial management, no more making decisions about my money without my knowledge. And if we don't? Sophia asked, her mask of concern finally slipping to reveal the cold calculation underneath. Then my lawyer will make you. That got their attention. Your lawyer? Ricardo asked. Margaret Chen. She specializes in financial elder abuse cases. He's very interested in the loans you took out in my name, Ricardo. For the first time since they'd arrived, both of them looked genuinely worried. Mom, Ricardo said, his voice shaking slightly, you don't want to involve lawyers in family business. We can work this out ourselves. We could have worked it out 3 years ago if you'd been honest with me then, but you chose deception and manipulation instead. Sophia grabbed Ricardo's arm. We should go, she said. Let her cool down. He's obviously upset and not thinking clearly. Not thinking clearly. Even now, even when I was demonstrating more clear thinking than I'd done in 3 years, they couldn't acknowledge that I might be making rational decisions based on accurate information. I am thinking clearly for the first time in years, I said. Clear enough to see that you never wanted a mother or grandmother in your lives. You wanted an obligation that could be managed efficiently and kept out of the way. That's not fair, Ricardo protested. What's not fair is spending 3 years in emotional isolation because you convinced me I had no choice. They left without saying goodbye, their footsteps echoing down the stairs like a countdown to the end of everything we'd pretended to be as a family. But as I locked the door behind them and stood in my empty apartment, I didn't feel sad or angry or afraid. I felt free. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of practical challenges and emotional breakthroughs. With Margaret's help, I regained control of all my financial accounts, dissolved the power of attorney arrangements Ricardo had used to manipulate my money, and began the process of understanding my actual financial situation. It turned out that despite Ricardo's deceptions, I was in better financial shape than I'd been in years. The investments he'd made with my money had indeed performed well, and even after accounting for the loans he'd taken out for his own benefit, I had enough resources to live comfortably for the rest of my life. More importantly, I had enough money to live how I wanted to live, where I wanted to live, with or without my family's approval or assistance. I formally moved out of Sunset Manor, a process that required more paperwork than moving in had, and began the task of turning my empty apartment back into a home. Mrs. Rossi helped me find affordable furniture at estate sales and thrift shops. Nothing fancy, nothing that would impress Ricardo or Sophia, but comfortable chairs and tables that felt like they belonged in the space Roberto and I had shared for so many years. I hung my photographs on the walls, filling the emptiness with images of our life together. Roberto and me on our wedding day, looking impossibly young and hopeful. Ricardo as a baby, as a little boy, as a teenager graduating from high school with a smile that reached his eyes. I put Roberto's watch on the dresser in our bedroom, next to the books I'd been accumulating over the years. I planted herbs in window boxes on the fire escape, filling the apartment with the smell of basil and oregano and rosemary. Slowly, the space came back to life. The hardest part wasn't the practical arrangements or even the legal complications of undoing Ricardo's financial manipulations. The hardest part was accepting that the son I'd loved and sacrificed for had become someone I didn't recognize. Someone capable of treating me as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be cherished. But there was unexpected grace in that acceptance too. Once I stopped making excuses for Ricardo's behavior, stopped trying to interpret his actions as expressions of love rather than control, I could see clearly what I'd been missing for years. I hadn't lost a loving son. I'd never had one, at least not since he'd become an adult. What I'd lost was the illusion that proximity to family members was the same thing as actual family connection. And what I'd gained was something far more valuable: the right to choose who I spent my time with, who I allowed into my physical and emotional space, who I trusted with my vulnerability and my love. The first person I chose was Carmen Rodriguez, a woman I'd met at the community center during my second week back in the apartment. She was 75, a retired teacher whose children lived in different states and visited occasionally, but weren't central to her daily life. I think the secret, she told me over coffee at the diner on 23rd Street, is building a life that doesn't depend on other people's approval or presence. Love your family if you can, but don't make them responsible for your happiness. Carmen became my closest friend, the person I called when I needed someone to talk to, the person who called me when she needed the same thing. We went to museums together, shared meals, watched old movies, and discussed books we'd both read decades earlier. She was family by choice rather than by biology, and that choice made all the difference. I also reconnected with Mrs. Rossi and some of the other neighbors I'd known during my first 43 years in the building. People who remembered Roberto, who asked about Ricardo but didn't judge me when I gave brief, non-committal answers about our relationship. They were my community, the network of connection and mutual support that institutions like Sunset Manor try to replace, but never can. Because real community is built on shared history and chosen affection, not just proximity and professional obligation. 3 months after moving back to my apartment, I received a text message from Ricardo. Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation, and I think there were misunderstandings on both sides. Would you be willing to meet for lunch to talk about moving forward? I stared at that message for a long time, feeling nothing. Not anger, not hope, not curiosity, just a kind of neutral recognition that this person who shared my DNA was trying to reestablish contact on his own terms. I didn't respond. 2 weeks later, another message. Mom, Sophia and I would like to bring the children to visit you. Isabella asks about you sometimes. Isabella. I wondered if that was true. If my granddaughter ever thought about the grandmother who'd been disappeared from her life as efficiently as furniture being moved into storage. I didn't respond to that message either. A month later, Sophia sent a message from her own phone. Maria, I know things got heated between us, but we're family. Isabella and Robert need their grandmother in their lives. Need. Not want, but need. As if my relationship with my grandchildren was some kind of essential service I was obligated to provide, regardless of how their parents had treated me. I thought about responding to that one, crafting a message that would explain precisely why Isabella and Robert's need for a grandmother didn't override my need for basic respect and honesty from their parents. But then I realized that any response would be interpreted as an opening for negotiation, a sign that I was willing to discuss terms for my re-entry into their lives. I wasn't willing to discuss terms. I wasn't willing to be managed or manipulated or lied to again, no matter what benefits they offered in exchange. Instead, I deleted all the messages and blocked their phone numbers. 6 months after moving back to my apartment on a warm spring afternoon, I was coming back from the grocery store when I saw a familiar figure sitting on the front steps of my building. Isabella. 9 years old now, tall for her age, with Roberto's dark eyes and Ricardo's stubborn chin. She was alone, which seemed impossible given how protective Ricardo and Sophia had always been about her activities and whereabouts. Abuela? She said when she saw me approaching with my shopping bags. My heart stuttered in my chest. She remembered me. After all this time, after all the distance her parents had created between us, she still knew who I was. Isabella, I said. What are you doing here, sweetheart? I asked Daddy to bring me to see you, but he said you were sick and couldn't have visitors. But you don't look sick. Smart girl. Smarter than her parents had given her credit for, apparently. I'm not sick, baby. I'm perfectly healthy. Then why can't I visit you? How do you explain family betrayal and financial abuse to a 9-year-old? How do you tell a child that her parents have been lying to her about her grandmother's availability and mental state? It's complicated, I said. Adult stuff that doesn't have much to do with you. She nodded as if that made perfect sense. Can I see your apartment? I remember it being different than the house in Westchester. I looked around, expecting to see Ricardo or Sophia lurking nearby, supervising this interaction, but Isabella seemed to be genuinely alone. How did you get here, sweetie? I took the train. I remembered the address from when we used to visit, and I looked up directions on my phone. She'd taken the train from Scarsdale to Manhattan by herself at 9 years old because she wanted to see her grandmother badly enough to figure out how to make it happen. Does your daddy know where you are? She looked down at her feet. Not exactly. I should have called Ricardo immediately. Should have let him know his daughter was safe, that she'd made it to my apartment without incident. Should have arranged for him to come pick her up immediately. Instead, I unlocked the front door and said, "Come on up, let me show you the apartment." Isabella spent 2 hours with me that afternoon. She helped me water the plants on the fire escape, looked through photo albums full of pictures of her daddy as a little boy, listened to stories about her grandfather Roberto that she'd never heard before. She was hungry for family history, for connection to something bigger than the insular world of private schools and scheduled activities that her parents had created for her. She wanted to know where she came from, who her people were, what traditions and stories and love had brought her into existence. "Why don't you come to our house anymore, Abuela? Your parents and I had a disagreement about some things. Sometimes adults can't work out their problems the way children can." "What kind of things?" "Nothing you need to worry about, baby. Nothing that has anything to do with you or Robert." "Are you mad at us too?" The question broke my heart. "Oh, sweetheart, no. I'm not mad at you at all. I love you and your brother so much. I think about you every day." "Then why can't you come to our house? Or we could come here more often." "That's between me and your parents, Isabella. But I want you to know that if you ever need anything, if you ever want to talk to someone or just need a place to go, I'm here. I'll always be here." When Ricardo's frantic phone call came, Isabella's school had called when she didn't show up for after-school care, and it had taken him an hour to figure out where she might have gone. I was ready for him. "She's safe," I told him before he could start yelling. "She's with me. She's been here for 2 hours and she's fine." "Jesus, Mom. You can't just keep her without telling us. We've been terrified." I didn't keep her. She showed up here on her own because she wanted to see her grandmother. She's 9 years old. She can't make decisions about where to go and who to see. Apparently she can, since she managed to get here safely. That's not the point. The point is that your daughter loves you, but she also loves me, and she's old enough to notice when the adults in her life aren't being honest with her. Silence on the other end of the line. "I'll bring her home," I said. "But Ricardo, she's not going to stop asking questions just because you don't want to answer them." An hour later, I walked Isabella to the subway station and rode with her back to Westchester. Ricardo was waiting at their station, his face tight with anxiety and anger. "Isabella, you can never ever do anything like this again," he said as soon as she was within reach. "You could have been hurt. You could have gotten lost." "But I wasn't hurt, Daddy. And I wasn't lost. I went to see Abuela, and she showed me pictures of you when you were little." Ricardo looked at me over Isabella's head, his expression unreadable. "Say goodbye to your grandmother," he told Isabella. "It's time to go home." Isabella hugged me tightly, whispering in my ear, "I'm glad you're not sick, Abuela." I watched them walk away, Ricardo's hand on Isabella's shoulder, both of their figures disappearing into the suburban landscape that had become their world. But something had changed that afternoon. Not between Ricardo and me. That relationship might be beyond repair. But between me and my granddaughter. She knew where to find me now. She knew I loved her and wanted to see her. She knew that whatever was happening between the adults in her family, it wasn't her fault, and it didn't diminish the bond between us. That knowledge would mean something to her eventually, when she was older and could understand the complexities of family loyalty and personal autonomy. When she was ready to make her own choices about who to love and how to maintain those relationships. For now, it was enough that she knew I existed, that I was available, that I'd choose her even when her parents chose control over connection. A year and a half after moving back to my apartment, I received one final communication from Ricardo. Not a text message this time, but a formal letter delivered by certified mail. It was from a lawyer, informing me that Ricardo was challenging my competency to make financial and medical decisions for myself. The letter cited my impulsive decision to leave Sunset Manor, my inappropriate living situation, and my refusal to maintain family relationships, as evidence that I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. If successful, the competency challenge would result in Ricardo being appointed as my legal guardian, with full authority to make decisions about my living situation, medical care, and financial assets. In other words, he was trying to use the legal system to accomplish what his financial manipulations had failed to achieve: complete control over my life. I called Margaret immediately. "This is actually not uncommon," she told me after reviewing the legal documents. "When adult children can't maintain control over their aging parents through emotional manipulation, they sometimes turn to competency challenges as a way of forcing the issue. Can he win? Not if we present this case properly. You're clearly competent. You're living independently. You're managing your finances responsibly. But we'll need medical and psychiatric evaluations to document your mental state, and we'll need character witnesses who can testify about your decision-making abilities." The next 6 months were consumed by legal proceedings that felt designed to humiliate and exhaust me into submission. Court-appointed doctors evaluated my cognitive function. Social workers visited my apartment to assess my living conditions. Lawyers deposed everyone from Mrs. Rossi to my pharmacist to Carmen, asking detailed questions about my daily routines and my ability to care for myself. Through it all, Ricardo maintained the fiction that he was acting out of love and concern, rather than a desire to regain control over my assets and living situation. His lawyer painted him as a devoted son who was worried about his mother's welfare, while painting me as a stubborn old woman who was endangering herself through poor judgment. The lowest point came when they brought Isabella and Robert to court to testify about their grandmother's behavior during our limited interactions. I watched my granddaughter, now 10 years old, answer questions about whether I seemed confused or forgetful, whether I'd said or done anything that worried her, whether she thought I was capable of taking care of myself. "She seems normal to me," Isabella said in a small voice that barely carried across the courtroom. "She remembers everything about when Daddy was little. She tells good stories and she makes good food and she hugs me like she really loves me. Hugs me like she really loves me." As if that kind of love had become rare enough in Isabella's life that she noticed it as something special. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Henderson, my former roommate at Sunset Manor. She'd been contacted by Margaret's investigator and had agreed to testify about what she'd observed during my 3 years at the facility. Despite being 87 and legally blind, she made the trip from Westchester to Manhattan to speak on my behalf. Maria was the most competent resident in that place, she told the court in a voice that shook with age but carried absolute conviction. She helped other people with their finances, remembering their medications, figuring out how to deal with family problems. Everyone went to her when they needed advice or comfort. "In your opinion," Margaret asked, "was Mrs. Gutierrez capable of living independently and making her own decisions?" "More capable than most people half her age," Mrs. Henderson replied. "The only thing wrong with Maria was that she was too trusting of family members who didn't deserve her trust." The judge's ruling, when it finally came, was unequivocal. Ricardo's competency challenge was dismissed with prejudice, meaning it couldn't be filed again. The judge specifically noted that I had demonstrated exceptional clarity of thought and sound judgment in extricating myself from a financially abusive situation and rebuilding an independent life. More significantly, the judge ordered Ricardo to pay all my legal fees and issued a restraining order preventing him from making any future attempts to control my financial or medical decisions. Outside the courthouse, Ricardo and Sophia waited on the steps like mourners at a funeral they'd been hoping would happen. "I hope you're satisfied," Sophia said, as I walked past them toward the subway. "You've destroyed your relationship with your son and grandchildren over money and pride." I stopped walking and turned to face them both. "I didn't destroy anything," I said. "I discovered what had already been destroyed years ago and stopped pretending otherwise." Ricardo stepped forward, his face contorted with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. Anger, maybe, or grief, or the kind of confusion that comes from having your fundamental assumptions challenged. "Mom, everything I did was for your own good. To protect you, to make sure you were safe and comfortable. I never meant to hurt you." For a moment, looking at his face, I could see the little boy he'd been, the child who'd sat at our kitchen table planning his future while Roberto and I sacrificed to make those plans possible. But good intentions don't erase harmful actions. Love doesn't justify control. And the fact that he still couldn't understand the difference between protecting someone and imprisoning them told me everything I needed to know about the man he'd become. "Ricardo," I said, "if you ever figure out the difference between taking care of someone and taking ownership of them, you know where to find me." Then I walked down into the subway, leaving them standing in the shadow of the courthouse, where their attempt to legally erase my autonomy had just been rejected by a system that, for once, had worked the way it was supposed to. That night, I called Carmen and Mrs. Rossi and Margaret, sharing the news of our victory with the people who'd become my chosen family over the past 2 years. We celebrated with takeout Chinese food eaten at my kitchen table, the same table where Roberto and I had once planned Ricardo's future, now repurposed for planning the rest of my own life according to my own values and priorities. As I looked around at the faces of these women who'd supported me through the most difficult period of my life, who'd chosen to love me without trying to control me, I realized something profound. I wasn't alone. I'd never really been alone. Even during those 3 years at Sunset Manor when I'd felt abandoned and forgotten, I'd just been looking for family in the wrong places, trying to find connection with people who were more interested in managing me than knowing me. Real family isn't about shared DNA or legal obligations. It's about mutual respect, chosen affection, and the kind of love that enhances rather than diminishes the people it touches. I had real family now. Not the family I'd been born into or the family I'd created through marriage and childbirth, but the family I'd built through friendship and community and the recognition of shared values. It was a smaller family than I'd once imagined having, but it was more genuine than any I'd ever experienced. 3 years have passed since the competency hearing. I'm 76 now, still living in my apartment on 23rd Street, still independent and healthy, and stubbornly determined to make my own decisions about how to spend whatever time I have left. Carmen and I have become inseparable companions, traveling together to places we'd never been able to afford when we were younger, and responsible for other people's dreams. We've seen the Grand Canyon and Niagara Falls, taken a cruise through the Panama Canal, spent 2 weeks in Italy eating food that reminded us both of our grandmother's cooking. Mrs. Rossi died last year, peacefully in her sleep at 89. I spoke at her funeral, standing before a church full of neighbors and friends who'd known her as a full person, rather than just someone's aging relative. Her daughter came from Chicago for the service, crying with what looked like genuine grief, but also, I thought, with regret for all the conversations they'd never had and visits that had been postponed until it was too late. I think about that sometimes. The conversations Ricardo and I will never have, the relationship that could have existed if he'd been willing to see me as a person rather than a responsibility. But I don't regret my choices. I don't regret refusing to be managed or manipulated or lied to, even when that refusal cost me my relationship with my son and grandchildren. Because what I gained was worth more than what I lost. The right to be myself, fully and completely, without apology or compromise. Isabella still contacts me occasionally, usually through social media accounts her parents don't monitor. She's 13 now, dealing with all the complicated emotions of adolescence while living in a family that seems to value control more than communication. Her messages are brief but meaningful. Hi, Abuela. Hope you're doing well. I think about you. Saw a picture that reminded me of the stories you told about Grandpa Roberto. Miss you. Dad says you moved away, but I know you didn't really move away. Love you. I respond to these messages carefully, never saying anything that could be interpreted as criticism of her parents, never asking her to choose sides in conflicts she didn't create and shouldn't have to resolve. But I always end with the same words. I love you, sweetheart. I'm here whenever you need me, because she might need me someday. When she's older and trying to understand her own worth, her own right to make decisions about her life without interference from people who claim to know what's best for her. When she's trying to figure out the difference between love and control, between family loyalty and self-respect. When she's ready to build her own definition of what family means and who deserves a place in the life she creates for herself. I'll be here then, if I'm still alive. And if I'm not, the example will still be here. The story of a woman who refused to disappear quietly, who fought for her right to exist on her own terms, who chose dignity over convenience and truth over comfortable lies. Last month, I did something I'd been thinking about for years. I wrote down everything that happened, all of it, from the day Ricardo and Sophia first suggested Sunset Manor to the morning I walked out of that courthouse with my autonomy intact. Not because I want revenge or because I'm trying to punish anyone, but because stories like mine happen every day to older people whose families love them just enough to want them safely contained, but not enough to actually know or respect them. And because Isabella might want to understand someday what really happened during these years when her grandmother disappeared from her life, then reappeared with boundaries and lawyers, and a stubborn insistence on being treated like a person with rights and feelings and the wisdom that comes from living through 8 decades of joy and loss and hard-won experience. But mostly, I wrote it all down because it's my story, and I have the right to tell it truthfully, without softening the edges or protecting people who didn't protect me. This is what happened to me. This is how I survived it. This is how I found my way back to myself after nearly losing everything that mattered about who I am and what I value. If you're listening to this because you recognize something familiar in my story, if you're dealing with family members who love you enough to control you but not enough to respect you, if you're tired of being managed and manipulated and lied to by people who claim to have your best interests at heart, I want you to know something. You have the right to say no. You have the right to make your own decisions, even if other people think those decisions are wrong. You have the right to live in your own home, spend your own money, choose your own companions, and define your own version of safety and happiness. You have the right to be seen and heard and valued for who you are, not just for how convenient you are to manage. And you have the right to build a family based on mutual respect and chosen affection, even if that family looks nothing like the one you were born into or the one other people think you should want. It's not easy. It's not comfortable. It requires giving up the fantasy that blood relationships will automatically provide the love and connection we all crave. But it's worth it. It's worth the loneliness and confusion and legal battles and family drama, because what you get in return is something precious beyond measure. The right to be authentically yourself, surrounded by people who love that authentic person rather than trying to reshape you into someone more convenient to their lives. I'm 76 years old. I live alone in a small apartment in Manhattan, surrounded by photographs of people I've loved and books I enjoy, and plants that know my voice. I have enough money to support myself comfortably, enough friends to fill my social needs, enough activities to keep me engaged with the world. I wake up every morning knowing that the day ahead is mine to shape according to my own priorities and preferences. I go to sleep every night knowing that I've lived that day as myself, completely and without apology. That's what freedom looks like at my age. Not the freedom to do anything I want. My body has limitations now that didn't exist when I was younger, but the freedom to be fully myself within whatever constraints exist. It's a different kind of freedom than I imagined when I was young, and thought freedom meant independence from all obligations and responsibilities. This is freedom that comes from choosing your obligations wisely, from understanding the difference between relationships that enhance your life and relationships that diminish it. This is the freedom that comes from refusing to be disappeared while you're still breathing, from insisting on your right to matter as long as you're alive. Have you lived something similar to what I've shared with you today? Have you watched someone you love struggle with family members who claim to care but really want to control? Tell me in the comments. Share your story, even if it's just a few words. Sometimes knowing we're not alone in these experiences is the first step toward finding our own path to freedom. And if this story touched you, if it reminded you that your voice and your choices and your right to dignity matter regardless of your age, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. Let's make sure these stories reach other people who need to hear them, other people who are fighting for their right to exist on their own terms, because everyone deserves to live their whole story, not just the convenient parts that other people are comfortable hearing. Everyone deserves to be seen and respected and valued for who they really are, including you.